Sisters, brothers, friends, the people of God, we gather together in God's name. Welcome to each one of you. As we gather in worship, I invite you to sign the attendance pads and pass them along the pews. And further, as we gather, what announcements do you wish to share?
It's time again. Our soup is almost gone, so we're going to do another soup making next Sunday after church. Bring your own ingredients. Let me know if you're interested in coming or participating so I have an idea of how many people will be there.
For those who aren't aware, we then sell the soup with money going toward Witness Projects Ministries. Other announcements? A reminder that after worship today, we have a fellowship potluck meal. Whether or not you prepare something, I think there is going to be plenty of food, so please join us for to enjoy the offerings of food that we love or tolerate, including some chocolate. Another reminder that the sign up for the next pancake breakfast is in the back. That's a breakfast that is open to anyone in the community. It's free, but it is, we do rely on people to help set up the night before and prepare the pancakes and sausage and all that we offer that day. This coming Wednesday is the beginning of Lent. It is Ash Wednesday. If any of you would like to have a time of receiving ashes on your forehead or on your hand, I have not a specific service, but I have an open time between 12 and 1 on Wednesday and between 6 and 6:30. If you want to have ashes and those times don't work for you, let me know. I'm available other times too. Are there any other announcements that you wish to share this morning? And let us continue in the spirit of worship. As you are able, I invite you to stand for the call to worship and our opening song, which is in Book 2.
Good morning. The last time I was worship leader, I quoted a piece from a favorite hymn of mine, which was, "Flower whose fragrance tender, with sweetness fills the air, dispel in glorious splendor the darkness everywhere." And I think that's kind of a great way, I don't know, for me to maybe start off worship this evening the way I feel. But if you'll join me with the call to worship. Come to the mountaintop to pray, for God will not keep silence.
We gather to listen for God's word and to make our response.
Come to the light of God's revelation, for we are in darkness apart from God's love.
The light shines in our hearts, giving knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ.
Come as God's covenant people, who serve and who sacrifice in faithfulness.
The heavens declare God's righteousness, and draw us to the excitement of worship.
Almighty God, giver of life, your light shines in our lives, and your glory is revealed through your Son, Jesus Christ. Reveal his glory to us as you did to Peter, James, and John, that we may be filled with his power, and our mouths may proclaim his presence forevermore. Amen. This morning's scripture reading is from Mark chapter 8 through verse 1 of chapter 9. And you can find that in the New Testament, your Bible, on page 59. 59. Excuse my eyes. Jesus asked his disciples who they think he is. Peter eventually replies that he is the Messiah, and Jesus tells him not to reveal this to others. A short time later, he corrects Peter for his assumption about Jesus' mission. To the disciples and to the crowd, he says that they will be challenged to take up their cross and to follow him. Later, Jesus takes a select group of the disciples to a high mountain where he is transformed. Moses and Elijah appear, and a voice from a cloud declares that Jesus is the beloved Son, and that they should listen to him. I'm going to read from the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And they had answered, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside, and began to rebuke him. By turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up the cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words, in this adulterous and unsinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed, when he comes into his glory. And he said unto them, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste of death until they see the kingdom of God has come with power.
Days later, Jesus took Peter and James and John to the top of a high mountain where they were alone. Jesus was transformed, transfigured around them, so that his clothes became dazzling white, brighter than any bleach could make them. Moses and Elijah appeared as well, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said, Lord, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Elijah, and one for Moses. He said this because he didn't know how to respond, because they were terrified. Suddenly a cloud appeared before them, and a voice came from the cloud saying, this is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him. Then the disciples found themselves alone with Jesus. As they came down the mountain, Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened until after the Son of Man had been raised from the dead. The disciples did as he said, even as they were wondering to themselves, what's this raised from the dead? The word of God. I invite the children to come forward at this time. Good morning. Today is a special Sunday. It's called Transfiguration Sunday. It's the Sunday before Lent begins. That's a big word. Do any of you know what transfiguration means? It's like transformed. Can you think of some things that might be transformed? Things around you. What are some things that transform? When you hear the word transform, what comes to mind? Transformers, yeah, so what do Transformers do? Yeah, from what to what? From vehicles to robots. Yeah, they have different personalities, different things that you see. What are some other things that you might see in nature that are transformed? plants can go from a seed to a flower or a vegetable or fruit. What else is transformed? Buildings can be transformed from an idea, an architectural blueprint into something that you see. What about caterpillars? What do they become? Butterfly, right? Do you ever help to cook or watch other people cook? What happens if you crack open an egg? It cracks. What happens if you crack open an egg and then put it on something hot? Does it become different? Does it look different? And once you have an egg that's been cooked, can you ever put it back in the shell? Does a butterfly ever become a caterpillar again? So some things that transform stay transformed. But transformers, can they go back and forth from seeing it as a car and a robot? It can go back and forth. What happened when Jesus took Peter and James and John and was transformed, was transfigured, was a little bit more like that. They saw him suddenly shining. His clothes turned bright, like this robe with lights behind it. But then it changed, and he was back to the way that they saw him before. He looked the same as he did before he went up to the mountain with them. But they saw him differently because they knew that he was something more than what they had seen before. So like with Transformers, once you know something can become a robot, will you ever see it just as a car or a helicopter or a truck again? Or can you always see it also as a robot? Once the disciples saw Jesus as more than just an ordinary looking man who walked among them, they would always see him in that way too, even though they didn't understand and they were scared at first. When we live the way Jesus teaches us, we too are transformed. Do you know the best way we can transform someone else in the way that we should, that others can see a transformation in us? What are things that we can do that show how we are transformed? What happens to a face when you smile? Yeah, so when you smile, when you're really, really happy, when you really smile, not a camera smile, but a smile that shows when you're happy, it has effects on the other people around us. When you do something kind for someone, when you show love, that transforms relationships. Maybe not in the way that bright lights show, but inside, where it really counts. So join me in a prayer. Dear God, thank you for amazing transformations, like caterpillars into butterflies, and food that goes from one form to another, and even for buildings that go from plans to places where people can live and work and learn. Thank you for transformers that remind us that sometimes things can be seen in more than one way. Thank you most of all for Jesus, for the view that the disciples had of seeing him bright and shiny, for your story, for your words, for your promise that transforms even us in the way that we live. We thank you for all this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you. For the us sing Christ upon the mountain peak. If any of you would become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. These words are at the core of many Christians' identity and mission. They've been the source of multiple hymns and anthems. Devotionals challenge us to consider our crosses as a measure of our faithfulness. When you hear these words, what do they mean to you? What does it mean in our context to pick up our cross and follow? This is an audience participation. So what does it mean when you hear pick up your cross and follow? Act. What else?
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, talks about cheap grace. And he says, I think in it, when Christ calls a person, he calls him to take up his cross and follow him. And I just think in America, how fortunate that we are that such a cost is not life or death, but it is really not that difficult that we do that, but that we try to live our lives and be as possibly as good as we can be in dealing with other people.
Others, what does it mean to you when you hear these words, take up your cross and follow me?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice. What else?
No hesitation.
No hesitation. That's even harder.
Bring your burdens.
Bring your burdens. Any other thoughts?
You don't have to be perfect.
You don't have to be perfect. Keep thinking about this. Some years ago, before a national youth conference, the preacher for the evening wanted a physical demonstration of this scripture. I was a youth worker for the week, one of the many young adults who are brought in to help go for whatever needs to be done, to run errands, to help behind the scenes. And that night, I was one of a few people assigned to carry a rather large, but still fairly lightweight, cross outside the worship arena in a silent vigil. I wasn't supposed to say anything. But I was fascinated by the response I had from others as they were coming into worship. Some people didn't notice me at all. They were in their own conversations as they walked by. Some people offered to take a turn carrying the cross. I shook my head no, because I didn't want them to be late for worship and because I felt it was my responsibility. That could probably be a whole other sermon in and of itself, or maybe a therapy session. Others looked, stopped, and then continued on their way. I wonder what they thought before they entered worship that night. In our context, the image of the cross is so familiar to many of us that we probably don't even think about how shocking it would have been for those to hear in that original context. Jesus' disciples wouldn't have had any idea of what it meant to carry a cross, to intentionally, willfully carry a cross. Crucifixion was reserved for the lowest, most despised of criminals and political challengers to Rome. These were the ones that Rome wanted to make an example of for others. From our vantage point, it may seem like the disciples were incredibly dense. The idea of one they had just proclaimed as Messiah nailed to the cross would have been impossible for them to consider. It just wouldn't have made sense to them. What many of us have taken as a basic tenet of Christianity was beyond their ability to understand. It didn't fit. The elective class this morning talked a little bit about Jewish understandings of Messiah. Being nailed to a cross wasn't part of it. It was hard enough for the early Christian community who heard this gospel, who knew the story of Jesus being nailed to the cross, while the disciples were living it. The idea of taking up their cross, at least as we have usually understood it, would have been the opposite of what a Messiah was supposed to do and be about. It was as if he was telling them that they were following someone the surrounding community would have seen as a loser. And so the Gospels give no response to Jesus' words. Whatever reaction the disciples or the crowd around him may have had is lost to us. And there is this abrupt change from Jesus' speech to them to what happens 6 days later. It is as if what the disciples didn't understand was simply put aside until later. And what is a theme throughout the Gospels. The disciples can see, sometimes more than the surrounding crowds, but they often don't fully see, nor do they understand. Sometimes, like Peter blurting out that Jesus is the Messiah, they stumble on the truth. And even then, their vision of who Jesus is and what he's about doesn't always match what Jesus is trying to convey to them. Jesus' words about the cross were put aside in the minds of the disciples. They were more likely to hear other phrases, he said. Things like, comes in glory, or there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. These were words that fit their vision of Messiah. Losing life might make sense for a warrior in battle. Willingly giving up one's life in a shameful way, or the idea of gaining life by losing it, didn't fit any context they could imagine. That part isn't so different for many of us today. In an online forum last week, I came across another understanding of this taking up the cross. A different way the disciples might have heard these words. Here's your mini Greek lesson for the week. The Greek word for cross, as it is most often used, is stars. But in its original form, long before it was used in the New Testament, it referred to an upright pole or stake. It was the base on which a top part would be added to form the cross as we envision it today. But in earlier forms, it was used more generically. In some cases, it was the stake where a person might be impaled. But in much less gruesome images, it was also simply a pole, such as what might be used to support a tent. In some commentaries, there's a suggestion that what Jesus said, or at least what the disciples heard, was that if they wished to become his followers, they had to be prepared and committed to a life that could mean pulling up stakes and going wherever he led. A nomadic lifestyle, which is indeed what they had. Maybe that sounds too tame. It certainly seems less dramatic than being willing to be crucified. A little bit of inconvenience, impermanence, uncertainty. It can be disoriented, but it's nothing compared to willingly marching to one's death. Although that's true, even this tamer understanding is a challenge and affront to those who value their freedom and independence. Like the instructions to the disciples to go into villages without any of the normal provisions, the story from last week, Jesus was asking them to have radical trust, to go wherever he led them, to be willing to set aside their own desires, and to take things into their own hands. Whether that meant a cross, whether that meant refusing to return violence for violence, or whether that meant living and entering into places that were foreign and strange to them. For us as believers today, who are far from the cross as more than a symbol, who are not likely to experience death as a result of our faith, the idea of carrying our cross as a sign of willingness to follow Jesus and to allow him to set our direction is still a challenge. Maybe this interpretation is a bit of a stretch. I don't necessarily offer it as a replacement for what you may already believe about what Jesus is saying to the disciples. But the two understandings of cross, both the cross as we see it and the cross as a movable stake, might both be at work here. Especially considering what happens when Jesus takes Peter and James and John up to the mountain. Out of their comfort zones, part of a literal mountaintop experience, they encounter something unlike anything they had ever experienced, and Peter especially has no idea what to do. The story of transfiguration, this odd story found in Matthew and Mark and Luke, seems designed for no purpose other than to convince the disciples and the later audiences that Jesus is something special, worthy of their devotion and their allegiance. Unlike other miraculous healings, no one is restored to the community, no one is delivered from pain and suffering. This isn't a teaching lesson for crowds of people. It is intended for a very small and private audience, and it is filled with symbolism. Moses and Elijah appear, symbols of of the law and the prophets. That they appear and talk with Jesus is, in and of itself, astounding to the disciples. Add that to the radiance coming from his clothing, and it's no surprise that Peter and James and John have no idea what to do with it. Sometimes, when you don't know what to do, the wisest thing is to remain silent. Peter was never known for his thoughtful, measured speech. So instead, he blurted out this idea to make this transcendent moment something permanent. Forgetting about Jesus' instruction to take up crosses and follow him, he wanted to pitch tents, to bask in the glow of what seemed like perfection. Far from a temporary dwelling place, a space to see something and move on, he was ready to create houses, tents, dwellings on the mountain, even if it meant leaving behind those other disciples. They were terrified, but instead of acknowledging that it was something outside what they could imagine, Peter tried to control it by talking his way through it. If he could control the conversation, then maybe he could also gain a sense of control over what was happening around him. With people who were dead and had been taken up to heaven, appearing before Jesus out of time, out of understanding. I can imagine Peter continuing on in a litany of how wonderful and perfect this moment was, and how he wanted to make it last. When this voice came from a cloud saying, "This is my dear son. Listen to him." Listen to him can be both an affirmation that the words Jesus was speaking were both trustworthy and true, and that perhaps it would be better for Peter to just stop talking and listen. That too is a challenge for many of us today. Somewhere in this intersection of terror and wonder, there was a greater truth to learn. Something that wasn't just meant for a mountaintop, but would be important to remember later. Jesus brought the law and the prophets together. He shone with an outer worldly brilliance. And then as quickly as the moment came, it passed. Jesus was alone with the disciples once more, looking as he had before they went up the mountain. They had been given a vision of something amazing and brilliant. But it was up to them to figure out how to integrate what they had seen with what they had known before and what was to come. As Jesus led them back down the mountain, he told them to say nothing until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Once again, they were challenged with a different view of reality. A time when it would be even harder to reconcile terror and wonder. We have the advantage of knowing the whole story, to know that, yes, at the end of the story comes a cross, but beyond that comes an empty tomb. The disciples didn't have that understanding, that vision in mind. They only had a time that was coming when they would be unable to see how they were supposed to follow Jesus. And although the cross would be before them, they wouldn't be sure where and how they could pitch their tents to be with him. Some would run away, some would wallow in despair, some would simply wait, and some would stubbornly refuse to leave. For us in the church today, transfiguration is an extra opportunity for us to see Jesus through the eyes of the disciples before the journey of Lent is before us. We can see the cross, but we can also see transfigured glory. The cross ugly to our eyes, is also a reminder of the breadth and depth of God's love for us. It is a reminder of glory and relationship, and it comes with a challenge. How will we see Jesus in the midst of terror and sorrow around us? I recently heard that a few days ago, Boko Haram attacked Chibok, Nigeria again. To those who are still reeling from the kidnapping of school children years ago, those who have been assaulted for their faith and their commitment to educating boys and girls, life is full of terror and destruction right now, with little glimpse of glory. Homes have been destroyed. It is easy to see people divided into friends and enemies. And it is tempting to allow pain to turn into bitterness and a desire for revenge. On a much smaller scale, it is easy to see that in our nation, where strident views on both sides tempt to tear us apart so that we can no longer be in dialogue and only see one another as us and them. And friends, this is not the way of Jesus. How Nigerians hold on to faith in the face of such terror is at the heart of Christianity. How we respond to our neighbors, large and small scale, is a challenge to see something between seeing wonder and fleeing from terror. For us, sometimes picking up a cross means a willingness to die for faith. Sometimes it means trusting Jesus to lead when we are tempted to go our own way. And sometimes both of these things happen at once. For those who do not live in true terror for their lives, Lent is a beckoning to come out of our comfort zones, to offer ourselves, holding on to the brightness of Jesus. In so doing, we also learn how to hold on to one another. After all that Desmond Tutu experienced in South Africa, years of violence and racism through apartheid, he held fast to a different vision of the future, saying, "My humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in theirs. We belong in a bundle of life. We say a person is a person through other people. It is not, I think, therefore I am. It says rather, I am human because I belong. I participate, I share." Maybe that is the greatest gift of transfiguration and transformation. Because in that moment of glory and terror and wonder and confusion, this voice coming from the cloud saying, "This is my son whom I dearly love, listen to him." We too find something to listen to. We too hear this call to live, to be transformed in one another's lives, and to allow ourselves to be transformed by the love of God that shines in, around, and through us as a body. May it be so.
Through our offerings, we purport prophetic leadership, provide possibilities for mountaintop experiences, and enable the teaching ministry of our church. Our generosity can make a difference in the lives of people we will never know and in our own lives as well. Let us give from our hearts in deep thanksgiving. Use our gifts, mighty God, to bring light where there is gloom, hope where there is despair, peace where there is turmoil. May Jesus Christ be proclaimed among us and around your world, even when we don't fully understand your message. May righteousness and justice prevail in spite of differences. We dedicate ourselves in this offering to you to use for your people everywhere.
Oh God, you draw us to you. We pour out our hearts. We offer what we are experiencing, trusting that you hear what we say. You hear even what we cannot bring to words, things that are too tender to speak aloud. Somehow in the offering of our lives to you, you are able to transform them. We know that there is an old saying that joy shared is twice joy and sorrow shared is sorrow halved. We offer it all to you, O God. Thankful for the way that you hear us. Thankful for this community that takes what we share with care and love. We ask for you to continue to transform our lives as we move past the things that trouble us, as we seek healing, and as we seek to offer ourselves as healing agents for others. We ask for healing for the brokenness in our world, the places where violence seems to reign, where ecological destruction threatens our very survival as a planet, where intolerance, hatred, and fear prevent us from being able to see a way forward together as your people. Into our fears, speak peace and hope. Be with us as we explore new medical possibilities, treatments, as we are with those who are preparing for surgery and recovering from surgery. Be with those who are grieving and suffering. Be with those who are rejoicing in new accomplishments. Keep drawing us together. Keep transforming us as a people called by you to serve you with faithfulness, to be willing to pick up our crosses and follow, whether that leads us into places of danger or just invites us into what is unknown, where we have to trust you and you alone to guide us, to lead us and sustain us. This is your promise to us. You call us your beloved. You call us your own people. So guide us. Help us to live out that calling. Help us to listen to your voice. And help us to respond in every way that we can, so that through our lives others may know you as well. All of this we pray in the name of Christ. As we go forth, whether to join in a meal or to go into the wider world, may God bless us. May God bless the food that we eat and the company that we keep. May God fill our deepest needs and give us hunger to serve others. May we be transformed in our faith so that we would give our lives willingly, that we would pick up all that prevents us from following, and would, with joy, go where Christ leads. In your name, O God, we pray as we go into this week, as we go into a time of fellowship, as we go about the work that you have given us to do. We seek your peace, and we are led by your justice. In Christ we pray.